3 men were thrown out of a window, and the apocalypse began. It was 1618 in Prague. The Czech Protestant nobility stormed into the royal castle's hall, grabbed 2 imperial governors and their secretary, and threw all 3 out the window. The fall was about 20 meters. Miraculously, all 3 survived, landing in a pile of refuse. Later, Catholics would say angels caught them. Protestants claimed it was manure that saved their lives. This moment, one of the most absurd starting points for a disaster in world history, triggered a war that, over 30 years, would wipe out 1/3 of Germany's population. To understand how Europe ended up at that window, we need to rewind the clock, about a century and a half back. And here's where things get really interesting. By the 15th century, the Catholic Church had stopped being just a religious institution. It had transformed into a full-fledged political player, with armies, territories, and an appetite for power. Popes launched crusades not against infidels, but against Catholic monarchs who didn't toe the line. They sold indulgences, essentially trading tickets to heaven for cold, hard cash. They owned vast estates and crushed peasant uprisings. Imagine the head of the largest charity also commanding an army and buying up real estate across an entire continent. Trust in such an institution was bound to crumble. Then, in 1517, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. 95 points exposing what had gone rotten in the church. 1 monk, 1 door, 1 sheet of paper. Yet that single sheet tore Europe in 2. Martin Luther's ideas spread like wildfire through dry brush. By then, Gutenberg's printing press had been running for over 50 years. Pamphlets flew from Wittenberg to Prague, from Prague to Geneva, and from Geneva all the way to Paris. In every city, at every university, and in countless taverns, people read these texts and nodded in agreement. He was right. Reformers multiplied faster than Rome could excommunicate them. Europe stopped being united in faith, and with that, it stopped being united at all. But the real issue wasn't just religion, it was a geopolitical tinderbox beneath it. By the early 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty controlled lands that left every neighbor breathless. The Spanish branch held Spain, southern Italy, and the Netherlands. The Austrian branch ruled the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, one family stretched its grip from Amsterdam all the way down to Naples. Keep France in mind. At this moment, it quietly watched the Habsburgs' power grow, and the unease in Paris grew deeper with each passing year. France will play a crucial role later on. Inside the empire itself, the principle of the Peace of Augsburg ruled. Whose realm, his religion. It sounds straightforward, but in reality, each prince forced his own faith on his subjects. Lutherans persecuted Catholics, and Catholics pushed back against Lutherans. By the early 17th century, the empire had fractured into 2 armed camps, the Catholic League and the Protestant Union. These 2 factions, loaded with weapons and grudges, faced each other, waiting for a spark. Then that spark flew out of a Prague window, landing in this powder keg of a world. They dragged 3 officials out of a ditch, brushed them off from manure, and sent them to complain to the emperor. Sounds almost comical? For now, yes. But what followed wouldn't be funny for a very long time. The Czech estates went all in. They didn't just rebel. They refused to recognize Ferdinand II as their king and placed the German Protestant prince Frederick of the Palatinate on the throne. A man who had more ambition than soldiers to back him up. This was a direct challenge to the entire Habsburg system. The response came fast. The Catholic League's troops and Spanish relatives, the very second branch of the Habsburg family tree controlling half of Western Europe, rushed to the emperor's aid. But the Protestant Evangelical Union, which was supposed to protect the Czechs, did absolutely nothing. No armies, no money, not even a clear statement of support. The Czechs were left completely on their own. In 1620, everything ended in just 2 hours. The Battle of White Mountain, a hill just a few miles from Prague. The Czech army collapsed so fast that some regiments never even got a chance to fight. The November mud hadn't dried on the imperial soldiers' boots before the executions began. This is where we need to pause, because what happened next wasn't just a defeat on the battlefield. It was the destruction of an entire nation for 3 centuries. The Czech nobility was either wiped out or forced into exile. German nobles replaced them. The Czech language, the tongue of Jan Hus spoken by millions, was demoted to the language of peasants and servants. And the Czech crown became the hereditary possession of the Habsburgs. To be exact, it stayed theirs until the First World War, almost 300 years. 1 battle, 2 hours, 3 centuries of consequences. It seems like the lesson is clear. Never rebel against the Habsburgs. But in 1625, King Christian IV of Denmark jumped into the war. Behind him stood the deep pockets of England, France, and the Netherlands, 3 of Europe's largest treasuries. The Danish army was well-equipped, well-paid, and absolutely confident of victory. They were crushed. Imperial generals Albrecht von Wallenstein and Johann von Tilly smashed the Danes just as methodically as they had the Czechs before. Christian fled back to his islands. The Protestant cause seemed dead. But here's the problem. The victors turned out worse than the defeated. Here's why. Wallenstein built his war machine on one brutal principle. War feeds war. The soldiers didn't receive paychecks. Instead, they were allowed to live off the land they marched through. Imagine you're a farmer in Silesia or Saxony. In the morning, you milk your cow. By noon, 20 musketeers burst into your yard. They seize your cow, your grain, the clothes hanging on your line, even your copper kettle. They tell your wife to stay silent. They tell you the same. This wasn't random looting. It was the official supply system for the imperial army. Even those who prayed alongside the emperor began to grumble. Catholic princes, whose peasants were being robbed by imperial soldiers, asked a simple question. How is this protection any different from an attack? But Ferdinand II didn't listen. He was drunk on victory. In 1629, he issued the Edict of Restitution, a decree demanding that Protestants return all church lands seized since 1555. 74 years of property redistribution reversed. Monasteries, bishoprics, entire towns had to change hands. This blow didn't just hit the Protestants. Moderate Catholic princes, who had supported the emperor until then, recoiled. Because the edict signaled one thing. Ferdinand was no longer interested in compromise. He wanted total control. The empire was winning on every battlefield. The Czechs were broken. Denmark was pushed out. Protestant princes fell silent. Wallenstein's army garrisoned towns stretching from the Baltic all the way to the Alps, feeding itself by taking from the locals. Hatred for the imperial tactics grew in every village, every ravaged town. That anger was building, creating a demand for an army that fought differently. This army came from the north, and it fought differently. In 1630, a Swedish force landed on the coast of Pomerania, led by King Gustav II Adolphus, a man who would later earn the title the Northern Lion. He was 35 years old. Gustav had ruled Sweden since he was 16. He personally led troops into battle against the Danes, Poles, and Russians. Twice, a musket ball wounded him, yet he spoke 6 languages fluently. Gustav wasn't a reckless warrior. He was a military engineer, a man who redefined the very mechanics of warfare. And this is where things get really interesting. Because everyone, literally everyone, tried to fix the chaos on the battlefields of the 30 Years' War the same way. Hire more mercenaries, put a tougher commander in charge, increase their pay. Or, like Wallenstein, ditch the pay altogether and allow looting. The logic was simple. War is a business for professionals, and the more professionals you can buy, the stronger your army becomes. Sounds obvious, right? But Gustavus Adolphus did something completely different. He rejected mercenaries altogether. The Swedish army was mainly made up of Lutheran conscripts, farmers and townspeople called to serve the crown. not professional killers who fought for the emperor one day and for whoever paid more the next. Just ordinary people who understood what they were fighting for. But that wasn't the main point. Gustav was the first in Europe to implement linear tactics on a massive scale, focusing on firearms. Simply put, he transformed the army from deep columns into thin lines where every soldier could fire without waiting for the front ranks to fall. Musketeers fired volleys, then stepped back to reload while the next line moved forward. The fire never stopped. Cannons became lighter. They could be moved during battle instead of being left behind like furniture. Cavalry charged with cold weapons without pausing to fire pistols, unlike the imperial forces. In my view, this is one of those rare moments in military history when it wasn't numbers, money, or politics, but pure tactical brilliance that completely changed the game. And the outcome came fast. In the fall of 1631, at Breitenfeld, the Swedes, backed by Saxon troops, crushed Count Tilly's imperial army. It marked the first major Protestant victory after 13 years of war. 13 years of defeats, retreats, and humiliation. Then suddenly, an army that beats the Catholics in open battle. The German Protestant princes, long silenced by fear, began rallying to the Swedes. By the winter of 31, Gustav controlled half of Germany. By spring of 32, his forces stood in Bavaria, the very heart of the Catholic stronghold. Ferdinand II stared at the map and knew, if he didn't stop the Swedes now, within a year they would be at the gates of Vienna. On November 16, 1632, two armies clashed near Lutzen, just outside Leipzig. The morning broke thick with fog, so dense you couldn't see more than 20 steps ahead. Gustavus Adolphus himself led a cavalry charge on the right flank. At one point, he surged ahead of his troops, took a bullet to the arm, then another in the back. He fell from his horse. Imperial soldiers finished him off with a shot to the temple. Later, they found the king's body, stripped and trampled into the mud. The Swedes won the Battle of Lutzen, but they lost the war. Not right away, of course. The army kept fighting. But without Gustav, without his tactical instinct, his authority, and his ability to unite the German princes, the Protestant coalition started to fall apart. By 1635, the emperor gave in and signed the Peace of Prague, scrapping the hated Edict of Restitution. In other words, he admitted he had gone too far. But here's the strange part. Neither Sweden nor France accepted this peace. Sweden refused because they had invested too much in the war to walk away empty-handed. And France, a Catholic power, had no religious reason to get involved at all. Their reasons lay somewhere else entirely. A war that began over faith was losing its last traces of religious meaning, and those who now stepped into it no longer bothered to hide behind any masks. In 1635, Catholic France officially declared war on the Catholic Habsburgs and stood shoulder to shoulder with the Protestants, not in secret, not through intermediaries, and not hiding behind some dynastic dispute. Openly. Cardinal Richelieu, the Prince of the Catholic Church, a man in a red robe, sent French armies to fight alongside those whom Rome labeled heretics. But wait, if this war was religious, how could that even happen? Here's the thing. The conflict had long stopped being about religion. Or rather, maybe it never truly was. From the very start, France wasn't focused on crosses and altars. They were looking at the map. And on that map, the Habsburgs surrounded them on all sides. Spain to the south, imperial lands to the east, the Netherlands to the north. France was trapped in a ring. Every time the emperor won a victory over the Protestants, the ring tightened. For years, Cardinal Richelieu paid off the Swedes, the Danes, and German princes, whoever it took, just to keep them fighting and keep the Habsburgs distracted. But after Gustavus Adolphus died and the Peace of Prague was signed, those hired hands ran out. France had no choice but to take matters into its own hands. Simply put, France funded someone else's war for as long as it could. When it couldn't anymore, it started its own. This is where we need to step back from the battlefield and look at the whole map. By the mid-1630s, this was no longer a religious quarrel. It had become two geopolitical powers, like two tectonic plates, colliding head-on. On one side stood the anti-Habsburg coalition led by France. Their allies included Sweden, which stayed firmly engaged even after the death of its king. The Netherlands, who had spent the last 20 years fighting for independence from the Spanish Habsburgs, also joined. Alongside them were scattered German and Italian principalities, each nursing their own grudges against the emperor. On the other side was the Habsburg bloc, the Holy Roman Empire, meaning Austria and Bavaria. Spain formed the other wing of the Habsburg eagle. Behind them stood the support of Poland and the Papal States. Officially, they claimed to defend the Catholic faith, but in reality, they were protecting their own dominance. Two coalitions, two sets of interests. Faith flew as a banner, but the real decisions came down to something else entirely. What about the rest of Europe? Not everyone jumped into this meat grinder. England, a Protestant power and the natural ally of the anti-Habsburg coalition, didn't even show up on the continental stage. They had other priorities. In 1640, the English plunged into their own civil war, Parliament against the king, Roundheads against Cavaliers. The islanders had enough on their plate. Meanwhile, Switzerland, caught between the warring sides, chose armed neutrality. It sat behind its mountains, watching neighbors tear each other apart. This was one of the earliest examples of Swiss neutrality, a stance that would become the country's defining trait for centuries to come. But let's return to those who fought. Because after France joined, the war didn't speed up. It grew more desperate. The battles swung back and forth. French forces advanced, the imperial armies counterattacked, the Swedes seized a city, and the Bavarians took it back. No side landed a decisive blow, and the main battlefield remained in Germany, the very Germany that had been fighting for 20 years straight. 20 years passed. The fields lay fallow, no one left to sow them, no resources to do so. Villages burned for the third or fourth time. Armies survived by looting since no centralized supply system existed. By then, the soldiers were no longer passionate fighters for faith, but mercenaries from all over Europe. They swept through villages, seizing livestock, grain, clothing, and moved on. Another army would follow, taking whatever was left, and very little remained. German lands turned into scorched wastelands, places where there was nothing left to fight for. Yet no one could stop because too much blood and money had been poured in. This is what happens when the masks come off, and wars are fought not for an idea, but for territory. An idea at least promises an end, a victory of true faith. But fighting over borders never ends, because a border can always be pushed another city further. And each one of those cities is already a pile of ashes. This endless slaughter couldn't go on forever. The land where the battles raged was running out, along with the people who lived on it. Sooner or later, the rulers would have to sit down and try to carve up what was left. They came to a stop. In October of 1648, two cities in Westphalia, Münster and Osnabrück, signed treaties that officially ended the 30 Years' War. Officially, because for millions, the war had ended long before. They simply didn't live to see peace. And this is where we need to pause. Germany lost 1/3 of its population to war, famine, and disease. 1/3. Every third person living there in 1618 was dead by the time peace was declared. In some southern duchies, Württemberg, Bavaria, the Palatinate, 2 out of every 3 people died. To grasp the scale, if the same thing happened to modern Germany, it would mean losing 27 million people. That's like wiping out all the residents of New York City and Los Angeles, twice over. And most of them didn't die in battle. They died from typhus, dysentery, and starvation because armies, both theirs and the invaders, stripped every grain of food. Villages stood empty. Fields grew wild with brush. The stench of fire and decay became so common, people stopped noticing it. A whole generation grew up knowing nothing but war. That was the price of 30 years. But the rulers gathered in Westphalia weren't counting bodies. They were counting territories. And the year 1648 redrew the map of Europe in a way that still echoes today. The first, and arguably the biggest loser, was Spain. Just 100 years earlier, it had controlled half the known world, from the Philippines to Peru. But after the war, Spain lost its status as Europe's dominant power. Naval supremacy shifted to the Netherlands, the very nation Spain had tried to crush for decades. On land, power moved to France. Madrid was left with a vast colonial empire, but without the strength to hold it. Actually, the strength was still there, but the will and the money ran out first. The second wave of change swept over those who gained independence. The Netherlands and Switzerland earned official recognition as sovereign states under the terms of the Peace of Westphalia. The Dutch fought for their freedom for 80 years. The Swiss fought even longer. Now, their status stood confirmed on paper, sealed and signed by the major powers. What had existed in practice was finally secured in law. The third group were the victors, who seized new territories. Sweden gained control over Pomerania and several other lands along the Baltic Sea coast. The Baltic Sea essentially became Sweden's own inland lake, stretching from Finland all the way down to northern Germany. This small northern country, with just over 1 million people, rose to become one of the continent's great powers. France, meanwhile, annexed Alsace and a few border provinces to the east. At first glance, just a handful of provinces. But these very lands would spark wars between France and Germany in 1870, 1914, and 1939. 3 wars fought over a single strip of land. The seeds were sown right here in Westphalia. Here's how the aftermath unfolded. Spain was toppled from its throne. France rose to prominence. Sweden transformed into an empire. The Dutch and the Swiss gained their freedom. Germany lay devastated, its lands ravaged, its population shattered, fractured into hundreds of small states. Each now decided its own alliances and faith. Borders were redrawn. New powers emerged. Millions died, leaving fields untended, fields no one was left to farm. But the deepest consequence of this war wasn't about who claimed Alsace or Pomerania. It was the birth of an idea, brand new at the time, that rose from the ashes and still shapes the world today. The rules that shape our world rarely come from the minds of philosophers. They emerge from the dirt, from bloodshed, at the breaking point where the old order shatters beyond repair. And when that happens, there's only one option left: to create something new. The Peace of Westphalia marked exactly that kind of turning point. It buried a centuries-old idea that Europe was a single Christian realm, united under the spiritual authority of the Pope and the political power of the Emperor. For 1,000 years, that system creaked but held together. Now it collapsed. In its place rose something fundamentally different: the state as the central actor in global politics. Not an empire, not the church, not a dynasty, the state. And with this came the birth of a principle we now call sovereignty. Simply put, it's the rule of the master in their own house. Every nation was recognized as completely independent within its own borders. No pope, no emperor, no neighboring king had the right to interfere in its internal affairs. Want to be Catholic? Fine. Prefer to be Lutheran? That's your choice. Want to trade with your neighbor's enemy? Go ahead. That's your foreign policy. Sounds obvious, right? But back in 1648, this was a revolution. It's like if today, every country in the world agreed that no international organization could ever dictate their domestic policy. Ever. And then they put that agreement in writing. Now let's see what actually happened on the ground, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire itself. Officially, it didn't disappear. The name stayed, the emperor remained, but real power, almost gone. German princes gained the right to form their own alliances, conduct independent foreign policies, and choose their own religion for their lands. The empire transformed into a loose confederation of about 300 independent states. 300, each with its own army, customs, and laws. The emperor could ask, could persuade, but he couldn't give orders. The changes in religion were just as profound. Calvinists, once not even recognized, were now granted equal rights alongside Lutherans and Catholics. More than that, for the first time in European history, people won the right to privately practice a faith different from their rulers. Your prince is Catholic, but you're Protestant? You no longer have to flee or hide. Pray at home. No one will bother you. 30 years of war, 8 million dead. Provinces burned to ash, where grass grew, where cities once stood. And here's the paradox. This apocalypse gave birth to a system where religion was no longer a valid reason to start an invasion. The bloodiest religious war in European history turned out to be the last. But the ideas that sprouted from the ashes of Westphalia didn't stop there. Protestant thought that people have the right to determine their own destiny had already taken root far beyond the German principalities. It reached the Netherlands, where the Republic grew stronger. It laid the groundwork for what would later be called European nationalism. While the continent was tallying its losses and adjusting to new rules, a fire was igniting on the British Isles. There, the question of the people's rights cut even deeper, because it wasn't aimed at a distant pope or an abstract emperor. It was aimed squarely at their own king. And this king would soon lose not just his crown, but his head. Every time one country today tells another, "This is our internal affair," it echoes back to the year 1648. Every border on today's map, every embassy, every diplomatic protocol, all of it grew from the ashes of the 30 Years' War. A world where 8 million lives were lost so we could live in a system we hardly even notice.